So I want to start by sharing this map of The Hague, the Netherlands, where I spent a long part of my career after leaving Zurich. This is a map of a city that is very close to me. I taught here, I worked here, I lived here in TU Delft, which is close to the city. The city is sort of a thing to cherish and be proud of in the Netherlands because it stands for peace, security, justice. But at the same time, it's also a highly unequal city. There's lots of inequalities of various kinds in energy, housing, mobility, and things that I also study in my own research about urbanization and challenges with inequality. This city has multiple challenges, but a few of those are to adapt to a changing climate, obviously, with the same as other parts of the world, managing migration in a dignified way for many communities who might be coming there or forced to come over, providing for growing energy demand, also in part because of AI prowess and new data centers coming up in the Netherlands as well. But I think what's interesting and tragic is that all of these are related to one thing, which is trying to reduce socioeconomic inequalities in essence, because if we don't tackle those, then we are simply entrenching those inequalities with adaptation, with managing migration, with providing for growing energy demand. So we really need to break down and look at different communities and people and neighborhoods in cities globally. This particular example is about the energy transition that is quite progressive in the Netherlands, but also ongoing still. And the municipalities there offer subsidies to buy solar panels, get reimbursement for it from the government, which seems on the face of it that it helps a lot of people. I'm showing a plot about two things: accessibility score on the vertical axis versus the solar potential that a residential property could make use of or benefit from on the horizontal axis. Right? And you see four numbers here, four communities in the city, one from non-native renters, low home value, high rise, all the way to number 4, which is native homeowners who have high home value and live in low-rise detached houses in the city. So from 1 to 4 is lesser disadvantage as you go up. 1 is the most disadvantaged community, 4 is the least disadvantaged community. What was very interesting to see was that the ongoing process of putting solar panels on your rooftop, the energy transition process in the city and in many cities in the Netherlands, has not really worked out for a lot of people. The part where the communities in red live in the map in the center and on the axis, and also on the periphery somewhere, are people who have the highest solar potential, the dark red and gray, but also have the least access, right? So they can really use the sun to produce more energy, but they don't have the capacity to actually access the subsidy for various reasons, because theory of planned behavior tells us that A, they don't live in their own houses, so they can't really negotiate with landlords. Split incentives might be at play. B, they live in tall buildings, so they can't really talk to 100 other tenants or residents to figure this out. C, they might not have the financial capital upfront to buy these, get them set up, or know-how or language know-how of the place. So lots of reasons contributed to this clustering analysis that led us to learn that even from an economic standpoint, this subsidy process is not really working out, right? So who are these people? As I've talked about, they are highly vulnerable and deprived communities, but people who are in the blue on the top also are very highly they can access these subsidies really easily. They have also very high residential solar potential, but only a few houses that you can spot in the map, right? Now, this story is a story of The Hague. It's not the story everywhere else in the world. There are other stories at play, but there are also other inequalities at play, not only in the energy system, but also in the housing system, in the mobility system, and so on. This is a project where we looked at now shifting from energy to mobility or active mobility, moving from your home to a place of interest like parks, community spaces, green spaces, food options, healthcare centers, and so on. And we find out that in most cities in the world, disadvantaged people have lower access to these kinds of communities. Cities like Chicago, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, Miami, but we have this also done for 40,000 other cities in the world, and we find the same systematic disadvantage in many, many, many countries around the world. There are other urban systems like in Western Europe where interestingly and counterintuitively, a lot of people live close to all of these facilities, yet they're highly deprived or disadvantaged. And in part, it's not the only thing that is necessary for having a good quality of life, right? Cities are complex ecosystems. There's also other factors at play, cities within cities or wider ecosystems and so on. But essentially, many cities across the globe, a lot of people don't have access to many amenities close to their neighborhoods, right? So how do we do that? How do we tackle these issues in a manner that we don't leave people behind? How do we provide better energy subsidies or better public transport options? We took an example to Hamburg, which is from an urban planning or policy perspective. It's quite a progressive city. The municipality invests a lot in open source software, open source community building processes, working with academics and stakeholders to try and understand where and how they can reduce these inequalities. From this example in Hamburg, we learned when we asked thousands of residents in the city, these are projects that the city is trying to unveil in your communities, from building bike lanes to providing high-frequency bus services, community space, green spaces, better food options, and so on. What do you think is more important to you, and why or why not, right? And doing some kind of natural language processing on it, we learned that there's a lot of spatial issues, spatial conflicts that arise when people are talking about what they need. People have diverse needs, obviously. They live in the same spaces, and so their needs might conflict with each other. Conflicts like equity and livability, which means if you want to lift up poorer communities or deprived communities, then areas might also be gentrified if the policymaking process is not holistic or integrated. Conflicts like ecology or livability, you want to improve living spaces, build more houses. Where do you get the space from? You have to get rid of some of the green spaces, perhaps, if there's not enough industrial spaces left in the city, or you have to sprawl, which means more public transport use or more private vehicle use, and so on and so forth, more emissions, right? And there's other kinds of conflicts. So we were able to work with the city and residents to figure out what the conflicts might be, and then the city went into a consultation process with certain specific communities and neighborhoods to try and figure out how they can reduce these conflicts and build together with people where all needs are taken care of. But it's a very localized process in those parts of the cities, right? So all of these spatial challenges, whether it's housing, energy, transport, ultimately are not about systems, but about people. There's a person at the heart of it who has to face this inequality at the end of the day. And we often see it, hearing, having a beer or dinner with all of you, that in your city you live in a certain area because it's slightly better, or you've passed through an area in your city which is, there's lots of entrenched inequality and it's not safe to live there. Ultimately, people are paying the price for cities not being able to cater for their people, right? It's not the systems that we need to make resilient, but we need to make them resilient for people. From anywhere of building bike lanes, Netherlands is a classic example, but also in Zurich, if you build e-bike lanes, that's a great idea, I think, but we need to think about it in terms of distribution of those, and especially for people who probably have the least access to economic resources and so on. Impacts of stressors on living environments, there's floods everywhere. Every part of the world, I think, has not been spared anymore. So how do we think about not only policy interventions, but also natural causes that affect people and build resilience for the least disadvantaged? And then existing inequalities. EU has a wide debate going on about it now in terms of policymaking as well, left behind neighborhoods, peoples, and places, which also polarizes then and has consequences for politics. So if we don't do multi-sectoral or integrated planning, we maladapt quite a lot, and then these infrastructures are there for a long time. We accumulate benefits only to select few communities and burdens to a lot more. And there's always a disproportionate impact to a lot of people, especially women, children, elderly, in many parts, especially of the global south as well. Now, solutions exist in a lot of disciplines. We've heard some amazing talks here in the last few days in housing, energy, transport, various sectors. Lots of interesting solutions exist. But I think the problem with inequalities is that it's not disciplinary. It's highly interdisciplinary and exists almost in all aspects of a person's life who's facing that inequality. And it's important to then understand the complexity of that space and how we can translate that complexity into actual working practices with other disciplines. I think the classic academic model of working in separate disciplines doesn't really work to tackle inequality, because we might tackle it in one discipline but exacerbate in others as well. Now, with the advent of data science, data literacy, more and more servers and server spaces coming up around the world, we're focusing a lot more on AI, right? So I want to talk a little bit about how urban futures are heading in a specific direction if they are not intervened with. This is an example from Jathan Sadowski about cyberscapes and cityscapes, and another one called How to Run a City Like Amazon and Other Companies, one of the more interesting speculative fiction books that I've read in my life, which shows that a lot of cities are offloading their ecosystems in the hands of private organizations, right? And making the city like an entrepreneurial ground where companies are now not being regulated by cities, but sort of regulating cities in a dynamic fashion. And this book points to various examples about various companies, and the futures don't look grim, don't look bright. So I would urge you to read the book if you're interested. From another point of view, cities also sort of outsource operation control, like Uber as a service, Airbnb as a service, X as a service, and so on. And in a classic, ironic example, now Uber starts selling trains, something that they were always against. But they sell train tickets in the UK because they haven't really made profit in over a decade by by navigating this car ecosystem, right? There's a lot more cars in public spaces. A lot more transactions happen in an entrepreneurial profit-making space, but people are not seeing the benefits of that. The third one is in ownership of public space, where municipalities, deteriorating municipalities, often sell public space to private landlords, and then housing, and not only housing, but also public space starts to be developed or utilized by private profit-making companies, right? And a neighborhood that is built as an urban innovation platform then starts to become a social experiment in different ways in how they can use data sets of people. And most cities in the world today are moving towards an urban future where at least in the global south, where urbanization is quite rapid, are moving towards a model where a lot of companies are now partaking in that, which is great, but without regulation, which is not great. We started working with an artist to try and understand these relationships, and all of this research put together as stories, because we were also talking about with some people that stories are very important, sometimes more than research. So this is a story where we try to explain that we're heading in a ship towards futures where there's entrenched inequality in the lower floors, and this flows from the trunk all the way to the higher floors where global cities reside. And this process of reducing inequalities is not going to work out as long as we are living in the same business as usual manner. So three key things from these kinds of practices is that benefit is often thought of as utilitarian. Let's do the best for most people, which doesn't work for a lot of people. There's countless examples of various cities around the world. The other is that decision makers are interested in bringing large form of investment only from a tech point of view or AI point of view or capital point of view, but not thinking about other kinds of needs in a city, like for social care, social housing, and so on. And lack of integration, which is, I think, one of the most important working with municipalities, that one department does not talk to the other while thinking about policy making in a long-term process, which is, I think, essentially one of the key things that we need to change in the way urban practice works. So when we started thinking about these things, and it's quite recent, we learned that a lot of focus is on data, models, and tools, not so much on stakeholders, values, and theories. And if it is, again, these communities are very different. People who are focusing on stakeholders, theories, and values are not working with people who are focusing on data, models, and tools. Very few people are, but not all of them. And then municipalities don't really get the benefit of this. It stays in the science part of things and not in the practice part of things, right? So I want to bring an example of what we are doing in Cape Town, South Africa, with the municipality there and also the national government, working with a fantastic PhD student. She comes from South Africa, has a lot of knowledge about the place as well. And what we are doing here is about participatory foresight, bringing participatory foresight into transport planning. Following up on the previous talk, I want to say slightly complementary things also. Traditionally, transport planning is always about predict and provide, right? We predict and provide management services so that we can manage traffic, manage our infrastructure, and so on. But a lot of people haven't benefited in the predict and provide approach, especially in places like Cape Town or in Delhi or in Dhaka and so on. And we are thinking here to move to a more decide and provide approach, which is a futures envisioning approach of asking people what they really want in their city in terms of public transport, and then evaluating those scenarios to build futures that they might be able to benefit from. Futures thinking approach is an approach that starts with determining a preferred future. Our preferred future was to think about from a justice point of view, because a lot of communities in Cape Town do live in very poor conditions, have longer distances to get to the CBD, don't get a lot of economic opportunities that they can get to in time, and the public transport system doesn't offer them enough alternatives to get there as well. So they have to buy a car, and then they get locked in that infrastructure, which is also very difficult to afford there. So here, determining a preferred future was about how can the public transport system tackle some of those inequalities for these communities. Then developing a series of plausible scenarios, because different people have different needs, and we need to get them to talk to each other to understand where needs overlap, where they diverge, and how can scenarios become stories, stories become real models, and models can then be evaluated and shared back with the communities, including the stakeholders who are actually building the policy, providing the infrastructure, and getting the things running on the ground. Establishing priorities, so which ones are better, which ones are worse, or which ones might cause more inefficiencies, more injustices in the system over time. And then test how these options perform in each of the plausible scenarios. So we needed to develop a measuring framework or a comparative framework to assess what justice means, how do you measure it, how do you evaluate it, and so on. So the first step was to identify stakeholders, engage with them, find out who has how much power in this process, and are there power imbalances? Can they recognize and negotiate and understand those? And we built this whole landscape of which stakeholders work in what capacity. It's quite complex compared to other parts of the world where we live. Here, the map is so complex that sometimes it's not even clear who has more power over a certain process or part of the process in actually making decisions, putting money, and then getting the ecosystem going, right? But we got to meet a lot of these people. The student especially met a lot of these people to talk to them, to figure out what's important, what's not important, how do they see the challenges that they face in the city, and so on. And then the next process was to invite people from the city. So we were able to reach a wide audience in the city who were part of a workshop with the stakeholders to tell us their visions of what they want from this future, what the problems might be, problems from safety to lack of integration. There's no one system where they can just pay on one app or even know one language. Different communities speak different dialects, so people sometimes struggle to even get a taxi from one part of the city to another because they might have to first take a bus, then a taxi, then a third kind of system, and all three operators might be different languages, different payment schemes, payment systems, and so on. And then there's issues of safety. Some people say, we cannot cross this bridge because we will be dead or robbed if we go over to the other side, right? So trying to understand what are the themes that people are talking about, what the drivers are of this challenge that they're facing, and how can we project that into an urban model that we build to realize that vision that they have. So we translated a lot of different inputs from many different people of all generations, walks of life, genders, and so on, to 4 scenarios or narratives or stories. From the current world scenario, what's going on right now, business as usual, where if nothing changes in terms of policy, infrastructure investment, or entrepreneurial investment, then how does the city transform in 10 years, 15 years? The third scenario is integrated and multimodal transport system. This is what most people wanted, that they should be able to use one ticketing system like TfL in London or something else in like Zurich, The fourth one was active travel. A lot more people wanted uh, to be to have bike lanes, to have lanes where they can do e-biking or different kinds of multi-mobility infrastructure that they might need, and so on. So all of these scenarios became stories for us. Took it back to the community to get them validated, to try and understand whether this makes sense in the topography, in the political climate, in the social needs of people's everyday lives. And to a lot of extent, they did. So we translate these scenarios to urban network models, models where there are actual nodes and links on the street systems. The existing public transport system is there. And we did something manually that a previous speaker, Lucas, was talking about in an automated fashion, which would be very interesting to connect the two. We did this manually in creating these future plans for the city where bike lanes exist or time to travel from one neighborhood to another reduces, or integration exists so people don't need to waste time in changing from one system to the other, and so on, or new public transport lines are coming up. To realize these four visions as models that we can then assess and evaluate with numbers given to them. So we developed this framework of how to do that, spatial justice framework, and I will put it up bigger so you can see what it is. Normally, these kinds of things are assessed, at least in Cape Town, South Africa, as one number. They look at it as from a Gini point of view, what the city might look like, how many people can get to how many job opportunities, for example, or green spaces, for example, in how much time. But that doesn't help us assess the inequalities that are entrenched in the city. It just compares the city with a previous example, a future example, or a different city, right? So we broke this down to the neighborhood scale and looked at something called spatial justice metrics that we developed based, again, on different ethical principles. Because we don't want to say that this is the theory of justice that you should apply in your city. People should come up with those ideas by themselves. They might consider justice to be a very different concept compared to what we might think or what Rawls was thinking many, many, many years ago, right? So we have three justice principles here. One is equality, the other is more utilitarian. Third is Rawls, which basically says, look at the worst stuff first and then move upwards. And I just want to wrap up with this last slide, or second last slide, talking about the results a little bit. So the first one is the current world scenario, right? And here we look at the three principles of equality, utilitarianism, and Rawls' reach, and see that the current world scenario, from an equality standpoint, only the central business district really benefits. The current world, the positive gap from this is positive, right? So the blue colors is better. This neighborhood fares really well, and the red colors are worse. So this neighborhood is not up to the mark in terms of equality. So there's more opportunities in the center of the city, the CBD, which is also the case in other parts of the world, right? From a utilitarian point of view, there's this central southeast area which struggles a lot, which is to say that a lot less people live there, but they also have a lot more inequalities present, right? And that doesn't consider them equal to other people in the city. The third example from the Rawls is to show that that same area where there was entrenched inequalities from a utilitarian point of view now fares slightly better, but not so much compared to other parts. When we do business as usual in 10 to 15 years, nothing much changes from the first row to the second row. So we keep continuing that same way. People don't think that any justice has been served. The third one is integrated and multimodal transport system, which is the last row here, where you see that there's a huge change now in, even from the equality standpoint. The colors have washed out, and most of the city is kind of positive gap, so a lot more people benefit. And from the utilitarian standpoint, nothing really changes because it's a utilitarian approach. A lot more people have benefited elsewhere, but not in the vulnerable areas. But from the third standpoint, the Rawlsian standpoint, vulnerable areas have been prioritized a little bit more. So they have benefited a lot more in this scenario. Right? So we can assess different visions, but not only different visions, different ways of looking at justice as well. And thinking about our learnings here is basically competing goals and priorities should be integrated. People should work together in a municipality. We should shift toward deliberative spaces, so models should work with people, not just informing them. And one solution will not fit everyone, so we need to think of tailored solutions. All my wonderful colleagues who've helped me along the journey, thank you so much.